Joining me today is Alyson Richman. And
Hi.
now I have to say Reichman or Richman. Oh, you can correct me. Okay. Yeah.
So nice
Uh,
to be here.
yeah. Allison's new book is The Missing Pages. In 1912, Harry Widener, a passionate book collector, boards the Titanic with a priceless book he recently bought in London. When disaster strikes, his last words are that he must retrieve the book from his cabin. Neither he nor the book are ever seen again. In his memory, his mother creates the Harry Widener Memorial Library at Harvard to preserve his collection. Years later, Violet Hutchins, a Harvard sophomore grieving her own loss, works at the library. As strange events unfold, Violet begins to wonder if Harry's ghost is trying to reach her, urging her to uncover a secret he took to his grave. Alyson Richman's graduated from Wellesley College with a degree in art history and Japanese studies. Her novels have been published in 25 languages and have reached the bestseller list both in the United States and abroad. Welcome to the show, Alyson. Nice to have you on this morning.
Thank you for having me on, Kathryn.
And I want to begin the interview. This is your new book, but your previous book was The Lost Wife, right? And it's about to become a major motion picture. And it's interesting because when I knew I was going to interview you, and I was doing a little research on my own, and it says some of the most popular historical novels, which yours is, are novels about World War II and women and about women in particular, who are spies or detectives in World War II. And that's not exactly what the story is about in The Lost Wife, but now you've chosen, but it is about World War II. This is about the Titanic. So, question: why the choice? Why your choice? In terms of choosing a historical novel, you decided on the Titanic.
Well,
That's
that's
a
a
long
great,
question.
but
Yeah.
it's a very good question. This my latest book, The Missing Pages. I wasn't planning to do a novel about the Titanic. It was sort of gifted to me, this idea from my daughter. She was doing a college tour of Harvard with her summer program. I wasn't with her. And when the tour guide got to the Harry Elkins Widener Memorial Library, he shared with the students that the library was named after a Harvard alumni by the name of Harry Elkins Widener, who was just 27 years old, a budding book collector who boarded the Titanic with his parents, and that there was this legend surrounding him that as catastrophe struck, his mother pleaded with him to get on the lifeboat with him, and he told his mother he had to go back to get this rare and precious book, and he was never found again, and the book was never discovered. And, after his death, his mother built this beautiful library with a memorial room in its center. And to this day, flowers are put every week by the librarian, which was stipulated by his mother when she gave the behest. And when my daughter told me this story, I was just instantly intrigued. I always loved the Titanic, but this was a story about a young man whose life was taken too soon. Did he, in fact, go back for the book, or was it something else? And then, of course, it's a story of a mother and son, and how a mother heals after her son's tragic death by making this incredible library for him. So, to answer your question, Kathryn, it was like an immediate emotional response as a mother myself, but also I was so intrigued. If there was, in fact, a book, was there any credibility to this legend that's told to these students to this day that Harry did go, in fact, to his cabin to retrieve it?
Well, is there? Have you thought? I mean, you've done obviously you did a lot of have done a lot of research. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I do think there's truth that Harry purchased a very valuable book when he was in London. I did go to London to go to Quaritch Limited, which was the bookseller that he bought this particular book that I think is the book he, might have gone back to get. It was a 16th century copy of Francis Bacon's essays with gilded edges. It was the only one known of its time that was so small. It was the size basically of the palm of your hand, almost the size of a baseball card. So it was, in fact, very precious. So I do know there was a book. Obviously, I don't know if he told his mother this as a gift of hope that he'd get the next lifeboat, and he just wanted to stay on the deck to be a gentleman like his father because he was traveling with his father. But seeing this story both ways, from the perspective of the mother who's desperate to save her child, and then her son who wants to give his mother a gift of hope that he's just going back for the book, was super intriguing. And that's why I actually decided to write, Harry's voice as the ghost inside the library his mother built in his honor, telling in his own words what really happened.
Why do you think there's this, and I think there is a renewed interest in the Titanic? I mean, just today, I mean, even within the past couple of years, and I just want to get your read on that. Why do you think that? I mean, the theme of, you mentioned grief. I mean, relationships between, people who lost people in the. Actually, I'm probably been there, Halifax, where they
Mm,
buried. Yeah.
yeah. So I think, I mean, it's a great question. And there is this renewed interest. I think there's a couple reasons. First of all, any person who boarded the Titanic has a story. If they perished, they have a story prior to getting on the Titanic, who they were, who their loved ones were, where they were going. If they survived, their story of survival is also incredibly, intriguing. And then there's this sense of putting the Titanic into historical context. It was a time during, great engineering, revolutions happening, where things were more faster and built in incredible ways. And the Titanic was supposed to be this unsinkable ship, and yet it sank. And so there's this, hubris to that. Like, can mankind actually ever create something that is infallible? I think there is this, obviously this terrible tragedy that this was preventable had they had more lifeboats. And I think that adds to this element of, intrigue's not the right word, but fascination with, the sense that there was an overconfidence with this particular vessel.
So we can identify with that
I think,
attitude. Yeah.
yeah. Well, you see now everything coming in with AI and,
Yeah.
engineering taking over, and people being scared, but also people being excited. There's that contrast between the two. And I just think we're in the middle of a new technological revolution. And I think when you put that into historical context of what was going on historically during this time period, there is a parallel.
Yeah. And also I'm thinking, when, I'm going back to the cemetery at Halifax, there was also this, the great unmarked graves, people who were poor, buried their loved ones there, couldn't bring them back to London. The very wealthy were able to do that, which I found that interesting, in terms of, how their grief and loss was handled, and what the very wealthy were able to do, and the poor, yeah, were not.
There's a
Yeah.
great divide,
Yeah,
obviously.
a great divide, which,
Between the super wealthy and the very poor immigrant class that was on the Titanic. You're absolutely right. That's another parallel that, we're seeing now with, our own landscape of our country.
yeah, exactly. I just learned from another interview. I don't know if it was another interview, someone I was talking to was saying that half the people in the United States only make $55,000 a year in
Mm-hmm.
terms of income. Anyway, so there is a great divide. We can get into the politics of that, but yeah. Okay, so your daughter, did you get into Harvard?
So my daughter actually ended up not applying to Harvard.
Oh,
She went to MIT. She's at MIT now, so that became sort of her first choice. And so I'm very pleased that she's still in the Cambridge area and she has access to the Widener Library to study. And the book is dedicated to her because she did give me this wonderful idea to write the book.
and she gave you the idea, and then what? Does she help edit the book? Is she part of the whole process? I mean,
No. So
no.
she basically, for me as a novelist, what happens is someone, people tell me stories all the time. I'll be sitting on the train and someone tells me a story. And I have an immediate reaction when there's a story that's shared with me where I'm instantly curious that I want to know more. There are pieces of the story that are unanswered. So, for example, did Harry go back for the book? And if so, what was that book? That was a question I had right away when she told me that story. And then, as I mentioned before, this emotional reaction, seeing it between two perspectives of mother and son. So, the first thing I do, I mean, not even before I've committed to writing a novel, is really trying to do a deep dive to see what historical information is out there. I need to create building blocks for a novel so that are grounded in fact. So one of the first things I did was go to London to go to the archives of Quaritch Limited to read the letters that Harry had written to Bernard Quaritch prior to purchasing what they call the Little Bacon. Then it was about learning about the Widener family. I mean, they have a fascinating all-American dream story. Harry's grandfather, sold mutton to the Union Army, made a fortune in that, and then invested in the trolley cars of Philadelphia, then took that money from, the burgeoning transportation system and infrastructure he built there, and invested in U.S. Steel. So it just, it's this self-made man beginning to collect and to establish themselves, the family through buying incredible art. Their ancestral home, Linwood Hall, which is just outside Philadelphia, was this sprawling estate filled with art. It was called the Versailles of North America. Some people called it the house that art built. So learning about his relationships between his, grandfather and his father and their collecting and why he was drawn to books, that was beginning to be a building block of this novel before I wrote the first sentence. And then learning about the bookseller A.S.W. Rosenbach in Philadelphia, who was the one who sort of nurtured him, mentored him, and helped him begin his book collecting. What was their relationship like? So once I started to do all of that and start to see that I had what I like to say is this armature of a character and who he came from and who he was, I then kind of dovetail it into this mystery, this legend that is passed down to this day. And then thinking again, before I start writing a single sentence, Kathryn, what is the doorway into this story? Yes, it has the allure of the Titanic and this young man cut down too soon, but how do I give him a voice? And when I thought about this beautiful memorial room that his mother had created in his library, that is like a reconstruction of his office with his oak bookshelves, his 3,000 volume book collection. Most of it is, in that room, his original desk and chairs, this idea that she stipulated that flowers be put on his desk every week. I started to think it had a spiritual feeling as well. This sense that, that room was the beating heart of the library, that his mother believed his spirit still existed. So why not write this book from the voice of his ghost inside the library, giving him the ability to be the ultimate narrator? I love to say a ghost is a perfect omniscient narrator because they know what happened in the past, but they're still hovering in the present. So that's kind of, from the gift of the story from my daughter to inhabiting my imagination and then my research, that is sort of the step in between actually sitting down at my desk to write.
Well, and the theme of grief, and what Harry's mother was able to do for him.
Mhm.
Uh, how does that fit into, let's say, mothers who have lost their sons
Mhm.
and want to preserve whatever they can in terms of the connection and the relationship? What can they do? They can't build a
Well,
lot.
they can't build a library,
They
a
can't build a library.
multi-million-dollar library.
Yes.
I think your question is very poignant because when we look to what Eleanor did, she channeled her grief. She had a project, and not every person who loses a child has the financial means, as you mentioned, to create a multi-million-dollar structure and monument to their, child who has died. But there are ways to channel grief into productivity and to creating a lasting legacy for someone who has passed. And I think, there's different ways. I mean, obviously there's charitable organizations, there's all sorts of things that people can do to make sure a name is not forgotten, and they can take this sadness, and the sadness doesn't go away, but it's channeled into something where there is productivity and there's a sense of as I mentioned, making sure that the person's name is never forgotten.
Yeah. Now I want to get back to the topic of books because I know you've mentioned, or at least I've seen it online, you're sitting, and I think you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, you're sitting on a train or a plane or wherever, and you see people reading a book and it piques your interest. Go back and forth from Albany to New York City, and I sit on the train and I am looking and I don't see many people reading books. Now, there may be listening to books, which is what I do, to tell you the truth, Audible. But is there, do you think there is an issue with people not reading books, that we are, on
Our
using our,
phones too much.
yeah, exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah. Um,
So it's interesting. I have felt in the past year that I am seeing more and more people and younger people holding books while they're reading. I mean, not to the extent of the way I saw before people had phone in the 90s, but my suspicion is that people need a break from being on their phones because the news is so distracting and upsetting and agitating that when you're in a book, you're not seeing something pop up in your news feed. And there is this ability to be transported to a book where you're just holding it in your hand and it's your relationship with the printed word. But you're right, it's definitely not, on the same level as it was before we all had these little handheld devices. But I think, what I was also mentioning before is that people share their stories with me. They tell me, if I'm having a conversation with them, they start telling me their personal story because I'm always talking with people. I always am
yeah.
interested in other people. And I think both reading a novel or talking with someone and sharing stories, it's about connectivity. It's about bridging, these universal ties that connect us all. We all have hurdles in our life. We all have, things that we are yearning for. And then we also have things that we're really proud about. Sometimes people tell, me stories about their children. But this connection, I think, is something that really needs to be fostered now, with so much, division within our country.
Division, depression, as you say,
Mhm.
or yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And there's that physicality. You're saying you're holding the book, you're turning the pages, right? It's
It's
very,
tangible and it's
it's
real.
tangible, it's
Yeah.
real. Yeah. And what do you see that? I mean, because obviously you're a novelist. What about with young children in the school system? Because I know my grandchildren, for instance, this is second grade, I guess. They go in there now. They all have computers, and that's what they're using,
Oh,
computers. Not
yeah.
all the time. I mean, obviously there's a school library, and
Mhm.
they're encouraged to take out books, but they are on their computers. They're not reading books
Not
in the.
only that, I had two children who went through the public school system, and I was really disappointed to know that they were given like PDFs of segments of books to then
Mm.
analyze and write reports. They didn't even read the full book in its entirety. And then they were getting these PDFs again, like you said, they could reading on their screen, and that just isn't the same experience. You're not forging a connection with the written word. And if you're not reading the whole book and you're just reading like a chapter of it, I mean, you're not getting anything, in my opinion. That said, I mean, I was very lucky with my daughter that at the age of 14, she got her working papers and started working at a local bookstore. And I think that was really wonderful for her because she also, got to be with older booksellers who were sharing what their favorite books were with. And with her small group of friends, I mean, I realize that they're probably an anomaly, but they don't just like to read books. They want the hardcover, like they want the
Yeah.
beautiful book.
They
They
want the
want
real deal. Yeah.
there's like an almost like old fashioned romanticism to them where they
Mhm.
want like the deckled pages or, it's really beautiful.
Well, she wound up at MIT. So she was, yeah. And yeah,
Interesting.
not at Harvard, but at MIT, but that's okay. Yeah, I'm just wondering what it's doing to the industry as a whole. Obviously, you have
Um,
access to that information.
yeah. So it's interesting because for a long time, I think novelists, we were really nervous about ebooks and, piracy with ebooks, not so much that people were reading ebooks if they purchased them, on Kindle or Nook, but that there was such an ability to steal information and get it for free that was really upsetting. Um, I think what I've noticed now is that people are also listening to Audible. They're listening to books. And that is, I think, helping with book sales, because obviously this is something that's, they do keep track royalty wise. So now you have the ability to read digitally, audibly, or, in the old fashioned printed version. And so with three different formats, I'm hoping that, books are still surviving in different forms.
And what about AI? How does that come into the picture? And you talk about, I don't know if you didn't mention plagiarism, but, people incorporating AI into books that they are supposedly writing. How does that work?
Ugh. I mean, I can't even fathom it, Kathryn. I
Yeah.
can't imagine entrusting a computer to, to write a book that I'm holding in my brain and my heart. I don't use that AI in my writing. Um, I will say there have been instances in my circle where I have seen AI creep up without it being formally identified. I have a friend in Sweden, and her book was supposed to be being translated into English. And she sent it to me and she's like, I'm reading the proofs for this, and this something seems off.
Mhm.
But English isn't my first language. Can you read this? And she sent it to me, and I was like, oh my God, this was translated by AI. This is
Yeah.
not the words it's choosing are odd, it's off, and I think people are overly confident thinking that it's going to do the job and not realizing that from my perspective, when you read something, it has to have a distinct texture and nuance of a human behind it. And if that's not the machine behind it, the brain, I'm going to feel a difference. I've seen copy for books being written by AI and feeling like this in your first reading of it might sound good, but when you start to dissect it, it actually is hollow and means nothing. It's almost like words strung on a necklace, beads that are
Mhm.
they're there, but they're not considered properly. So I can tell the difference. I don't know if the average reader can, and I don't know long term if people become desensitized to that nuance and people just, sets a precedence and people just start reading in the way like it's fast food, it's not nourishing. I don't know, Kathryn, but AI is going to affect every industry, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's unleashed, and we don't know the effects just yet. But I haven't spoken to a single professional that is not fearful in some way.
Well, yes, you're the professional. You recognize it, but maybe instead of going in the direction of being desensitized, we can go in the direction of teaching our children how to recognize
Mm.
when they are reading something that was produced by AI, for instance. Have the same kind of sensitivity, as I guess is what I'm saying.
Well, you're right, because I notice on Instagram that when people are starting to see videos that are created by AI and that there might be misinformation with that people are calling it out and saying, this is obviously AI, this is not real. And I think that's important to flag it.
I want to get back because we don't have that much time left. Because I do also want to get back to the Lost Wife because that's going to become a major motion pictures. Tell us about that.
Well, right now it's in development. There are three stages of a book becoming a major motion picture. There's the original option when producers think that this might make a really great film, and then there's development when money is put behind it to create a script by a professional screenwriter and get talent attached, a director, actors and actresses. So we're in the middle version. We're not at production with it being set to film, but there's the initial money and energy behind it, and it's been really wonderful and interesting and also frustrating. It takes a lot of time. I've been told it can take a really, really long time, but to see it translated into a script form, to see another creative take my material and build it out in a different way has been really exciting.
And it is a long process. I get that, but and you say it's exciting and frustrating. What are the what are the frustrations? Because I mean, when you put it in a totally different medium, does it change the whole emotional effect, let's say, of the book when you put it into a film?
So it doesn't change the emotional effect, but I think the biggest challenge is that you have to condense it to a finite amount of time, like a little bit over an hour and change. And so I might have had three characters do something plot wise that all of a sudden one character has to absorb all those different things. My book, The Lost Wife, pivots between the present and the past, and so how you transition to, back and forth between those two time periods so that the audience doesn't get lost. That's been kind of really interesting to see how a screenwriter masterfully can find these sort of different places to pivot. So that it's just really interesting, because when you write a novel, you're not thinking about time. I might be thinking about pages, but I'm certainly not thinking, how I only have, an hour and change to tell this story. And then, this sense of how do you take things where they're interior thoughts of your character and there isn't dialogue, and how do you convey that onto, the screen. It's been very interesting to watch.
Yeah. And obviously, and you're not doing it alone. I mean, as you mentioned,
Oh,
uh,
I'm not writing it at all. Like
yeah.
there's a professional. I mean, I can weigh in and have a conversation about it, but there's someone who, has many screen plays behind them.
Yeah, adapting. But so I guess you can't really tell us this, but like what are the most maybe difficult where you really have to, or you want to put your foot down and they yeah, and they do too. And then how do you kind of negotiate that?
So I think one of the most difficult things is that The Lost Wife begins at a wedding where a couple each believed the other person had died in the war, had been told erroneously the other person had perished, and yet they recognize each other, 60 something years later. And so I almost give the reveal right away in the, I guess it's not, I do in the
Uh-huh.
opening chapter. And for me as a novelist, telling this story was, it wasn't a trick pony, like, and then you find out that they reunite at the wedding 60 years later. It was about posing these questions to the reader that, why did they think each other had died? What was their initial love story? How did they survive the war? All these different questions. So I wasn't, trying to give away too much. I was setting it up to so that you ask these questions and learn through the next, 300 pages. But the screenwriter did not want to open it up in the same way. And so we're still having a conversation about the beginning.
So the conversation continues. Yeah.
Yes, the conversation can continue. We'll see what happens.
Very interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, there's lots more to talk about, but we only have a couple minutes left. So just tell us where we can get more information about the book, about both books, about and what you're doing, websites, platforms to go to.
Oh, perfect. So the missing pages should be available at all your big retail sellers, your independent bookstores. If they don't happen to have it, definitely you can ask for them to order it. It comes in a couple of days, and then all the online sites. So it should be available everywhere books are sold. I do have, and The Lost Wife, it's older, so you might have to order that online. It might be on your bookstore, but I'm not sure. And then I have a website. It's my name, Alyson, ALYSONRICHMAN.com. It has all my tour sites. I am going on, a tour. I'm going up to Harvard Bookstore. I have an event there on Friday, which will be really exciting, and a lot of other places. And then I'm on Instagram at Alyson Richman, just my name, and the same at Facebook. I don't do Twitter, or X, but
Okay. Well, we'll have
anyway,
to deal with that. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. That's great. Great having you on the show today. Thank you so much for all your insights. It was really fun. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was wonderful.
Joining me today is Lauren Stinestra, author of The Beauty of the End. Lauren Stinestra explores a world redefined by a shocking revelation. There's a biological countdown to extinction encoded into every living creature's DNA. For humanity, just 4 generations remain. How and when people choose to reproduce take center stage. She draws on extensive experience in science, public health, and crisis management to create a robustly imagined world that is rich with ethical quandaries. Lauren holds degrees in physiology and crisis management. She studied creative writing at UCLA and is currently completing her doctorate in public health at Johns Hopkins University. Welcome to the show, Lauren. Nice to have you on.
Thank you so much, Kathryn. Thank you for having me.
Well, this is quite a book. I mean, it's kind of scary. It's, I guess, based on science and also fiction. So start us off. I know you've had a lot of experience in scientific stuff, research, et cetera, diseases, COVID, um, public health. Now you're getting a PhD, right? So tell us the book. How does the science, the fiction, the idea, how did that come to you that the world could come to an end after 4 generations and we have to do something to mitigate it, whatever we're going to
Right.
do?
Um, the anxiety, the existential anxiety in this book probably betrays a little bit of when I wrote it, which was this was a COVID project for me that grew legs and I got it to publication. But that anxiety about what's going to happen to humanity probably stems from where my head was at this time. You may remember in 2020, obviously, we were dealing with COVID. And then if you lived in the Eastern Seaboard or in and around DC, in 2021, there was about to be this emergence of cicadas. And I did not grow up in Virginia. And I was like, what is happening? What kind of plague is this?
It's a
I was
biblical.
completely unaware of what periodical cicadas were. And I was kind of horrified by the idea that billions of insects were going to emerge all at once. But as a scientist, I was also fascinated. Like, how can all these insects synchronize their reproductive behaviors? How can they count to 17? So I did a deep dive on that. And as much as I disliked the idea of these insects emerging, in 2021, I was like, you know what would be worse is if they didn't come out. What would that mean? Probably something's really wrong with the environment or the planet or something like that. But I started to play with this idea about what could cause something so regular and so organized to suddenly cease. And so I played around with that idea a little bit. I've written about that in other places, but at the end of the day, I decided to give them a genetic anomaly. Basically, they have a gene in their DNA that they're gifted with that decreases with each reproductive cycle. This would work with their biology in certain ways to make them all go extinct at once. And so that's how I started with this extinction idea. And I thought, again, that would be enough of a premise. But to really raise the stakes in the novel, I wanted to then extend that genetic anomaly to humans. And that's where the idea came from.
But and you mentioned, okay, and part of this and part of the novel is that there are ethical quandaries that we have to consider. What are those?
Correct. One of the features in the novel, obviously, humanity discovers that it's got 4 generations left. And I started to hypothesize how humanity would react. And I do work in government, and I was trying to think about what government would do to address this crisis. Obviously, we're not at the dystopia yet. We still have 4 generations. This is not an emergency that's happening to you or your grandkids or or their kids. This is something that's 120, 150 years in the future. And so that's one of the ways my book is somewhat unique within the genre. It does not focus on what's happening at the very end. It focuses about what's happening at the beginning of the end. But one of the ethical quandaries that I put forward is it's possible that there would be incentives for reproduction. Um, Obviously, there would be scientific inquiries into how to solve this problem, but the book takes place in the 80s when we've just discovered genetics. We're just getting DNA science under our belt. We don't have CRISPR or manipulating DNA yet. And one of the best ways to search for other genetic anomalies is to look at DNA and how it combines um, between different partners. That is to say, every person in the world is unique by their DNA, and maybe one person has the solution to this. And so in the book, the government actually starts offering financial incentives for reproduction. There are one of two options that I put forward, which is waiting. Women will receive a large lump sum if they wait a long time to have a child. In this way, they extend the length of each of those four generations, essentially buying humanity more time to do the science. Elsewise, they can receive a different financial incentive for having a lot of children, essentially rolling the genetic dice, having those children screened to see if their DNA holds the key to breaking what I've called the limit.
So if you're paying women off, I guess, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, to do just what you described, that's there. That's also that is a huge ethical question, right? I mean, maybe the
right.
type of people who are going to actually agree to doing that. Okay, um, and okay, so that's one thing, and there are what two protagonists in this story, each one with a different motive.
Correct. I've centered the story around twins. They themselves are fives. They have five generations left, but they join the government agency that basically installs reproductive counselors across the country. And these counselors are supposed to coach women into making this decision about whether or not they're going to pursue these financial incentives. And the first protagonist, her name is Maggie. She is gung ho for this. She's excited. She wants to save the world. And she endeavors on a path that leads her to make some very difficult choices about whether or not to pursue certain matches, encourage women to make certain decisions. Obviously, this is fraught with moral peril for her, and that becomes the crux of the novel. And then the second protagonist, who is actually our narrator, her name is Charlie. And Charlie is antithetical to her sister. She's reserved, she's risk averse. She doesn't know exactly what she wants, but it's her sister. And the two girls have been adopted from a young age, pulled out of their family and their culture. And her sister is her security blanket. So she's willing to do what it takes to stay with her sister, especially in this, very dynamic, uncertain time. And she's drug into these decisions and is not as successful, not as gung ho. And I've chosen her as the narrator as opposed to Maggie because so many stories focus on superheroes and people who are willing to go the distance and really, do what it takes to save the world. And I'm not sure everyone feels like that all the time. And I thought it would be more relatable to pick the narrator that is uncertain, that is not sure about what she wants for herself or the world or her role in it, and somebody who's struggling with all these decisions. And I think that reflects, again, the time the book was written, and is reflective, I think, with a lot of the way people feel when they look at whether it's the pandemic or climate change. They can't see themselves as the hero, but the book will posit that everyone has a role to play.
Yeah, you mentioned climate change or now climate crisis actually, and we've had a climate crisis for a long time. And in the book, you're talking about this is something. This particular issue is not going to happen. It's four generations, so I don't know, 100, 150 years from now. And I think that's an attitude and has been an attitude in terms of climate crisis as well. Well, it's not happening now, so one of the many people don't want to even deal with it because and it continues to get worse and worse obviously, but yeah, so how do you compare the two? How do you get people interested in doing something, whatever it is, and people make different choices when the something is going to happen four generations from now?
Yes, this book was written with climate change in mind for sure. It is an analog to the crisis I've written, which is I think many books, movies, even real life crises can get behind, people can get behind taking action when the danger is urgent and in your face. But for these slow moving crises, when things aren't happening all at once or it's far in the future, it's a lot more difficult to get people invested and to get people to change their behavior because it's not happening to them. And that's why in this book, I did want to make those decisions revolve around children because I think mothers play a very important role, obviously, in many households and in many societies. But as a mother myself, what world am I leaving for my children is a pretty big motivator for me. What does my children's future look like? And so I wanted
And
to
why? And
center
I'm going
the
to stop you there because you're saying mothers,
yeah.
mothers as opposed to fathers, or men or women as opposed to men. A
Fathers
difference?
too,
Yeah.
fathers
Yeah.
too. I will
Yeah.
say my experience is limited to that of a mother. And I think that again, it's parents all over the world for certain, but certainly in my experience as a mother, I think about that a lot. But I'm not sure I am thinking about my grandchildren or my great grandchildren with the same investment or the same care. And this is borne out in the science to some degree. There are animals that will make sacrifices for immediate relatives, certainly their children, and sometimes aunts and uncles or other um, animals in their family unit, but there's a limit to where it goes. And if I remember my biology text specifically, it was about groundhogs and their willingness to whistle when predator birds were overhead. And they would do it for their family, but the limit of their empathy stopped at cousins. So cousins are 1/8 genetic material. That's how much they share. And groundhogs were willing to risk their own lives up to family members to include their cousins, but not beyond. And so that that percentage seems to also, you can trickle that down through parents, children, grandchildren. Are we caring enough about those who we don't have strong connections to? And so this book explores that to some degree, but I'm sorry, I wish I had the answer to what I
Yeah.
could, what we could do to make people more invested. But
Well, it's
I
difficult to
think there's
do
a,
that, I think,
yeah,
because, as you say, it depends on which mammals or groups that we're talking about. But you have your own children, and then you are obviously you're invested in your own children in a different way than you're invested in your grandchildren. You have less energy. You're older. You have so you know you're I'm a mother and a grandmother, and so there is a connection, but it is different, and you're different. Like,
mhm.
you're, yeah. And I think a lot of it has to do with how you're going to expend your just energy wise, just, in terms of, you're an aging person. So I think
Yeah, it's a limited resource.
it's a limited resource. Exactly. And I'm also thinking, because obviously you worked on COVID, et cetera, but with COVID, it's not exactly the same thing as climate change, but I had seen this TED talk that Bill Gates did 5 years before 2020, 5 years before COVID, and he mapped out exactly what was going to happen. That was a TED talk, right? So we had all that information, but we didn't do anything about it. Or I guess Obama tried to have somewhat of a plan, but then that got tossed in the trash. Uh, so there are those issues too, right? I mean, that's another example, I guess, of people or governments not wanting to deal with the issue. Well, whether it's COVID or climate crisis or a whole
Yeah.
list of others. Yeah,
Preparedness and
preparedness.
change
Yeah.
is expensive, not only from a financial perspective, but changing behavior, changing attitudes. Vigilance is very difficult to maintain, getting people to, as we've talked about, invest, care, prepare for, think about, and change their behaviors around. It's very, very difficult, especially in a situation where danger is not in your face.
So what do we do? I mean, maybe I'm back to the same question again. How do we get people? You're saying we can get mothers engaged. They're very connected. They want a better world for their kids. But people tend to live on their day-to-day basis, don't they? Send their kids to school, make sure they're healthy, all of, take vacations, do what they do, right? But the kind
Yeah.
of, yeah, outer worldly stuff is for somebody else, not out, is for someone else to take care of.
Right. Yeah. And creating that connection, and it goes to the personal perception of what duty and what role am I required to play? What do we expect of people? Um, Cultures with a more collective identity, if you look to parts of Asia, specifically Japan, their attitudes about preparedness and what they're able to achieve in terms of resilience to crisis is much better than the US. It's well documented in that case, but that's probably related to their cultural attitudes about what individuals do in their societies. And so I think there's some cues there we could look to, but individualism is a double-edged sword in some cases in terms of letting people do what they want and personal freedom, but also what do we owe to each other? We saw this in COVID with decisions around masking and decisions around vaccination. Obviously, it's a very personal decision for many folks, but when do we need to place that in a societal context?
Well, you're getting your doctorate in public health. Doesn't this have to do with, let's say, take COVID, public health, the greatest good for the greatest number? And public health is probably the number one thing or one issue or one service that we have in government that makes us a strong country, or at least, and um, I guess our weaknesses in terms of public health came out during the COVID crisis, right?
Certainly, there's a role for public health to play in national security, and there are some people. I'm working on a degree in health security specifically, and we like to say that health security is homeland security. It's having a healthy population is so much better for national readiness, national preparedness, making sure that we aren't vulnerable to things that might weaken us in so many ways, whether it's the economy, whether it's the population. Um, in that frame, yes, I think public health very, very important for so many things beyond just personal wellness or community wellness. But there's so many lenses by which public health uh, can really make contributions to the strength of families and the strength of cities, towns, states, neighborhoods, countries. And yes, this book does kind of tiptoe around what that would mean in terms of what role does the government play in making sure that the population is well and strong and is can survive versus what is the individual role in that as well.
How can I mean, because you are a leader in this field, and I guess you'll become, as it goes on, you'll become more of a leader. I, and I'm repeating it, but you're getting your doctorate at Hopkins. So let's kind of define public health in the context of what we've been talking about. How do you think people see public health, the general population?
Um,
Oh,
I think we're at a really difficult time for public health. I think especially in the wake of COVID, there's a lot of mistrust about what it means. And a lot of people correlate public health to the campaigns that threaten some of their ideology, whether it's vaccination, whether it's masking, whether it's the role the government can play in their daily lives, telling them when they can gather or not. So I think that people have a lot of fresh memories about that may grate against some of their values. But I think it's also important to remember that public health is also about um, helping with the male loneliness epidemic and the suicide crisis. And public health is also, had victories around underage smoking and vaping and those types of things. Public health plays a role in, shaping traffic laws and keeping people safe on the roads. It's a lot about extrapolating.
but okay, I'm going to
Um,
stop you there. People don't
yeah,
seem to have a problem with let's say how fast you can drive in a school zone, and they, I can drive 90 miles an hour if I want to. I don't know, not many people will say, yeah, I agree with that. That's my individual choice. But yet, if it comes to, like, yes, you need to you need a vaccine for polio or for the measles or the mumps, then it becomes an issue. I'm going to do what I want to do.
Right. And a lot of that is about bodily autonomy, which is explored in this book as well. And again, these two things are both very important and also held in tension in terms of what health decisions are personal and are contained within one body versus what health decisions may affect other people also. And we look to infectious disease often for these types of examples. But yes, um, it's a framework around American values, especially around independence and personal choice, that may work against some of the things that help us in terms of social protection, health security, those types of ideals.
Do you think that we are marketing the information correctly? That people really are somewhat in the dark about, well, the issues that we've been talking about. Yeah, we talk about don't smoke too much, don't drink too much, don't vape too much, all of those kinds of things. But when it does come to the other issues, and infectious diseases could be one, vaccinations, those kinds of things, we don't really, we do when there's a crisis perhaps, but in general the information is not out there, or it's not, we don't have PSAs, let's say, about these issues that involve public health.
Right. And I will tell you that in the public health community, they take a lot of responsibility for what happened to the profession in the wake of COVID, where people are mistrusting public health officials. And the public health community says, to some degree, this is earned. We didn't communicate well. And a lot of the research right now and a lot of the work that's going on in kind of rehabilitating public health is around public health communication, which is getting to the right messages to the right people in the right way. I think, compared to PSAs about drinking and driving, smoking, things like that, um, there's less individual variation. Across the board, pretty much drinking is bad for you. But unfortunately, with things like vaccinations, there are some people who are ineligible for vaccines for various reasons, or vaccines could be harmful for them, or they had a bad reaction, and those are real. And so it's a more nuanced conversation that needs to be had. And so it's difficult to write big, sweeping messages that universally apply to everyone and can be bumper stickered, for lack of a better word. That just can't happen in public health without alienating a important part of the population.
But when you talk about bumper stickers, but don't we have bumper stickers for advertisements? Americans take so much prescribed medication, and those are advertised on television. And at the bottom, they'll say, "Well, if you take this, you could die, you could become paralyzed," on and on and on. But people still take the medication. But the information, you know what I'm saying? But
Oh, of course,
yeah,
yes. Yeah, no, it's complicated. And the environment and this is where, again, a lot of research is going into what motivates people, how do people receive health messaging, what is health literacy in this country, and do people even understand the difference between technical terms around vaccination and whether or not it applies to them. And so that goes back to another latent issue related to education that I think society is still addressing as well, is we have a hard time getting these messages keyed into the right level for the people who need to receive them.
yeah, well, you can start off in school, can't we? I mean, there can be courses. We have AI to help us with that, to, give the appropriate information. Let's say to kids in elementary school, middle school, high school. Don't wait till we're 25, 35, 45 years old to give us the information. I think anyway, it's important to start when you begin going to school. I mean, it should be part of the curriculum.
Yeah, I know I didn't get health education, I think, until my freshman year of high school. That's when we had our health unit. But yeah, obviously, to your point, that leaves a lot more room for education on the front end, and getting people familiar with these terms and ideas and what it means to them. Talking to doctors, also very important, forming that personal relationship. But yes, there's a lot that can be done in that space.
Well, you say talking to doctors, but we now have so much more accessibility. I mean, whether it's on, all of the, social media, all of the stuff that kids and adults listen to or watch. I mean, it doesn't have to be, you have to go to the doctor's office to get the information, and they hardly actually, I think, don't necessarily provide the information. But it, I guess we have the ability to provide the information. I don't know. Does it have to do with funding? Is that one of the reasons why some of this has?
It
Yeah,
probably, to your point, it's an information rich environment. This data is out there. You can get it on podcasts, you can get it on social media, you can get it on TikTok, you can get it from your neighbors, from your church, from your school. It's mostly figuring out who is the trusted messenger, and that varies by individual quite a bit. And so I think that's where, in an information rich environment, how do we choose which voices to listen to?
yeah. And I think that's the
And
question. How do we choose whose voices to listen to? We have one
yeah,
minute left. I could go. I have so many more questions, but just give us. So give us information. Tell obviously about the book. Where can we get the book, and what website and platforms to go to? And
yeah.
for more information, yeah, 30 seconds,
Right.
actually.
So
Yeah.
the book is The Beauty of the End, and it's available through all major retailers and in all major formats. So it's in hardback, paperback, audiobook, and ebook. So everyone can choose their fancy on that. And if you need more information about me, my website is www.laurensteenstra.com. That's LaurenStienstra.com. And you can follow me on Instagram at Lauren Steenstra Writes.
Thank you so much. Great conversation. Lauren Steenstra, The Beauty of the End. Appreciate your time
Thank you.
today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. Have a great day.
Yeah, you too.